I'm Marilyn Benson, and I was commissioned on October the 17th of 1971. And I have served in, my first appointment was in the Rio Grande Conference and the Southwest Texas Conference in a pilot project. And I have served in the Kentucky Conference, the West Ohio Conference, the West Virginia Conference, and the New England Conference. Well, I grew up in the 40s, late 40s and 50s and part of the 60s. That was my growing up years. And that was in a little town called Brewster Mills in West Virginia, right below the Mason-Dixon line. First of all, I was born in 1944, so my family received additional ration stamps, food stamps, when I was born. So that helped the family out. And so that gives you a kind of a setting for the time frame for my life, early life. I grew up in the Methodist Church. We still had MYF and WSCS at that time. So I spent all the years that I can remember of my childhood. My family, they didn't send me to church, they took me to church. My first 2 years of ministry were as a US2 in Southwest Texas, but in preparation for that, we had a 6-week training program, and in preparation for that, I first heard about the Deaconess program. So every meeting I went to, whether it was of church and community workers, missionaries, United Methodist Women, which we became, I would hear about it. In fact, my father, whose background was really American Baptist, was also one of the people who someone had talked to him about it, said I should do that. So those are the places. It was before we were United Methodist, and just 2 years before, because I was a US2 from 1966 to 68, and so from that time on we were United Methodist, but that's what was happening in the life of the larger church. Well, my undergraduate degree was in Christian Ed, and I really I didn't do Christian Ed. Well, I did do Christian Ed a lot, but not in the formal sense. But it prepared me for a much larger ministry than that. And then I took 1 year at United Theological Seminary, and I kind of got bitten by the bug, and the church encouraged me to finish that degree, so I did come back to it after I had met my what I had promised to do where I was working. So I went back and finished that 3-year program and received an MDiv. As far as I know, it's probably one of the earlier people, or at least one of the more recent persons to be commissioned a deaconess. And so it was kind of an education for the school too, and they were very helpful in guiding me into the classes they thought would be most helpful, and so it was a great experience, and they participated in my commissioning. Well, it was almost all of it as a church and community worker, including the US2 experiences. And so I think I felt like if I had any particular area that I could contribute to, it would be that, because that was the kind of community where I grew up, you know, little towns and little churches, and so most of the appointments that I had were for larger parishes or group ministry settings, and so the first one was 4 little churches in South Texas. 1 was English speaking and 3 were Spanish speaking, and so when I worked in Kentucky, I think there were about 7 or 8 churches. By the time I got to West Virginia, there were like 20 27, 28 churches in that larger parish. So that's the kind of setting that I worked in. And it really was trying to help to bring some leadership to small membership churches who would not have been able to have afforded additional staff. They might have a part-time pastor, and even if they had a full-time pastor, it was just one. But because we could work together, and usually we had staff meetings, and it was the pastors of all of those churches and myself, sometimes the district superintendent. So it was an opportunity to do education for the staff, as well as for the membership of the churches. And some of it was frustrating, but most of it was really a great time of just learning from them, from their cultures, and each place was different, and finding out how the gospel spoke to those situations, and what would be most helpful to say or do in a given setting. So church and community is really a multifaceted ministry, and I like that because it's not so strict, but what you can look at your situation and with the people you're working with decide what most needs to be done, and you can do it. And the last place that I worked was really one of my favorite. I shouldn't say that because they were all favorites, but that last one was a place called Mary's Cradle, which was a maternal and infant resource center. And one of the things that we were able to do in that setting that I think sets us apart as a people of faith is, as opposed to a position in secular work, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but just to give you an example of how that might work. We might have a visiting nurse who would travel around to families that had newborn babies in the family, and she would try to ascertain how the baby was doing and how the family was doing and what their needs were. And sometimes there were things that we could do. We had, for instance, an infant who was born with a cleft palate, and those children need special bottles, nipples, for eating. I mean, they just cannot get the kind of suction you need to be able to eat. So we could provide things like that. One time, there are babies that have a lot of trouble with reflux. So this family needed a stroller that the baby was facing toward you. And if you think about most baby strollers, you're pushing them down the sidewalk and you don't see their face or what's going on. But they needed to keep their eye on that baby all the time, especially when they were out, because if they refluxed and then regurgitated that, they could choke on it. So we could do some special things like that, and where they didn't have funds that were designated for those, they had to spend their money on what the money was designated for, and so those were extra kinds of things. The other side of that was that when they felt like there was a spiritual need in the family, they were not allowed by law to say anything about that, but they could send them to us for other things maybe, and tell us maybe this is something you ought to talk to them about, or see if you strike up a conversation. And that was a really interesting and wonderful experience, and that the community had that kind of faith in us, that they would send their families to us. When I was working in South Texas, I had some very good experiences, interesting experiences. living in a community of, in a biracial, community, or bicultural, really more so, I think, than certainly what I had experienced growing up in Appalachia. So I learned a lot from the young people, particularly that I worked with, and from United Methodist Women also. And the young people told me the kinds of experiences that they had in school, and they were not allowed to speak Spanish. And that being the predominant cultural group and predominant language of the area, that was kind of would seem strange to me that they could not do that. And so I talked to the parents of some of the kids, and one man explained to me that if they started speaking Spanish in school, they would bend their hands back and slap them with a ruler. And it's hard to imagine that kind of situation in growing up in your school and having that. So those, I probably received more of an education than they gave to me, than I gave to them. But shortly after I finished the US2 project and I had moved on to the next one, I learned that the students had staged a walkout and raised some of those very issues, and so they began a movement, which I thought was really wonderful. And one of the interesting things about that experience with language, I knew Spanish, more textbook Spanish than common speaking, but a little bit. But Spanish is a very phonetic language, and its rules are almost always the same. They don't change for any situation. And so one day in youth meeting, I read the scripture for their gathering, and I read it from a Spanish written Bible. So they were all sitting there looking at me so amazed, and they knew that I didn't speak a whole lot of Spanish, but they said, "You can read Spanish?" And I said, "Yes." And I learned that they could not. And this was not a part of their education, to learn their own language, to be able to read their own language. So that was a real awakening for me, and I hope that now that situation is very different in those schools. Well, I certainly think it's the community that we share in, and the community that supports us even though we're not physically together in one place, and that it's the tool or the arm of the church and of God's Spirit that allows us to be called, and allows us to be supported, and to know that we are not alone, and that we have a much greater purpose than just ourselves or our little situation. I think one of the greatest challenges is working with other leadership and professional people within the church. And we, not everybody knows that deaconesses and home missioners exist. They know missionaries exist, and they know that local pastors exist, but they're not that familiar with others. And so, and sometimes we become territorial. All of us do, And so I think working out some of those problems, that was probably one of the greatest challenges that we have, that I experienced anyway, and I think that we experience as human beings. Go for it. I think, yes, I think that in our world today, we are more relevant than ever in the life of the church. And when I was in seminary, I would go to the library, and surprisingly enough, I found a lot about deaconesses from ancient history through, and ancient I mean biblical times. And there were times when the program just, I call it a program, but when the movement, I guess, just slowed down and was not legally within the church, at least existing at all. But then something would happen and the church needed us again, and so there would be a resurgence, and that, you know, happened over time. And I think we're in that kind of time, you know, right now, that there's really a place for people who do not serve from behind the altar, but out in front of it, or out in front of the church, or down the street. And sometimes we are the only people that, the only times when the church can touch some people is through the kind of ministries that we do. So I say yes, this is and it's wonderful to talk to new deaconesses and home missionaries today, and learn the new and exciting things that they're doing. And I just think that that's great to see that as sacred and holy ground, not just at the foot of the altar, but down the street. I think being a deaconess has really given me my place in life, and helped me to discern my own gifts and what I could give, even, and sometimes was doing it and not even knowing it. But that's the amazing thing I think about the way that the Spirit works within us, and that we are amazing people, and that we get to serve amazing people.